The morning mist hung heavy over the Catskill Mountains as Detective Sarah Chen stepped out of her unmarked sedan, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. The call had come in at 6:47 that morning, just as she was finishing her second cup of coffee at the precinct. A routine excavation for a new hiking trail had uncovered something that would shatter the quiet of this upstate New York forest and resurrect a mystery that had haunted the financial district of Manhattan for nearly 5 decades. Chen pulled her jacket tighter against the autumn chill as she approached the crime scene tape that now cordoned off a section of dense woodland near the village of Phoenicia. The orange and yellow leaves created a beautiful canopy overhead, but beneath them lay something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined when the construction crew had begun their work 3 days earlier. The excavator operator, a weathered man named Tommy Rodriguez, stood, smoking nervously beside his machine, still shaken by what he had unearthed. He had been clearing a path for what was supposed to be a simple nature trail when his bucket had scraped against something metallic buried deep in the forest floor. At first, he thought it might be an old septic tank or water pipe, but as he carefully cleared away decades of accumulated soil and decomposed leaves, the unmistakable curve of a car roof had emerged from the earth like a metallic grave. Chen approached. Rodriguez, her detective instincts already engaged. The man's hands trembled slightly as he took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes darting between her badge and the partially excavated vehicle that lay before them like a sleeping giant slowly awakening from its earthen slumber. She noticed his calloused fingers bore the permanent stains of a lifetime working with machinery, and his weathered face spoke of countless days spent under the harsh elements of outdoor construction work. "Tell me exactly what happened," Chen said, pulling out her notebook. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had spent 15 years investigating crimes across upstate New York. But there was also a gentleness that encouraged witnesses to speak freely. Rodriguez took a shaky breath before responding. "I was just doing my job, you know. Been operating heavy equipment for 23 years, and I never seen nothing like this." His accent carried traces of his Puerto Rican heritage, and Chen could see the genuine distress in his dark brown eyes. "First, I thought maybe it was just some old junk, maybe a septic tank like I said. But then I seen that shape, that curve, and I knew it was something else entirely." The Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow emerged from its burial ground with an almost ghostly presence. The once pristine British racing green paint was now barely visible beneath layers of rust, dirt, and the accumulated debris of 50 seasons. Mud caked every surface, obscuring the famous Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament and filling the gaps between the wire spoke wheels that had once gleamed with chrome perfection. The elegant lines of the luxury sedan were still recognizable despite the ravages of time and the Earth's patient embrace. As Chen circled the vehicle, her trained eye took in every detail. The soil around the car had been carefully packed and layered, suggesting this was no accidental burial. The depth at which the vehicle rested, approximately 6 feet below the current ground level, indicated deliberate excavation rather than natural settling over time. The New York license plate, though heavily corroded, was still partially legible. She could make out enough numbers and letters to confirm what she had already begun to suspect based on the preliminary report that had crackled through her radio during the drive upstate. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as Chen documented the scene. Ancient maple and oak trees stretched, their bare branches overhead, their roots likely having grown around and through the buried vehicle over the decades. The smell of damp earth and decomposing leaves filled the air, mixed with the metallic scent of rust and the diesel fumes from Rodriguez's excavator. In the distance, she could hear the gentle babbling of a stream and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. This was not just any abandoned vehicle. This was potentially the key to solving one of New York City's most enduring missing person cases. Chen felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a major break in a cold case, tempered by the sobering realization that they were likely dealing with a homicide that had remained hidden for half a century. The year 1975 had been a tumultuous time for New York City. The municipal government teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Crime rates soared through the city's boroughs like an epidemic, and the city's elite lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege that seemed increasingly fragile with each passing day. Against this backdrop of urban decay and financial uncertainty, the disappearance of prominent banker Harrison Blackwood had captured the imagination of the press and the attention of law enforcement agencies throughout the tri-state area. Harrison Montgomery Blackwood III was not merely wealthy. He was Manhattan aristocracy incarnate. Born into one of the city's most prominent banking families on a crisp morning in March 1942, he had inherited not only a vast fortune, but also a legacy of financial influence that stretched back to the Gilded Age, when robber barons built their empires on steel, oil, and railway fortunes. The Blackwood name appeared on the boards of major corporations, cultural institutions, and charitable foundations throughout the Northeast, carved into marble facades and etched onto brass plaques in some of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings. Their family bank, Blackwood and Associates, occupied a prestigious address at the corner of Wall Street and William Street, housed in a magnificent limestone building that had been constructed in 1897 during the height of American prosperity. The building's neoclassical architecture spoke of permanence and stability, with massive Corinthian columns supporting a pediment decorated with allegorical figures representing commerce, industry, and finance. Inside, the banking floors featured soaring ceilings, Italian, marble floors, and crystal chandeliers that cast warm light over mahogany desks, where some of America's most important financial decisions were made daily. The bank managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars for clients ranging from old New York families who had made their fortunes in shipping and manufacturing to new money entrepreneurs who had built empires in emerging industries like plastics, electronics, and aerospace technology. The Blackwood client list read like a who's who of American business, including steel magnates from Pittsburgh, oil barons from Texas, entertainment moguls from Hollywood, and technology innovators from the emerging Silicon Valley region of California. At 33 years old, Harrison was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in New York society, a status that brought both privileges and pressures that few could truly understand. Tall and distinguished with prematurely silver hair that caught the light like spun platinum and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense and into the heart of any matter. He moved through Manhattan's exclusive circles with the confidence that came from generations of privilege and power. His presence commanded attention in any room he entered, whether it was a board meeting in a corporate skyscraper or a charity gala in a Fifth Avenue mansion. Harrison was frequently photographed at charity galas, art gallery openings, and society weddings, always impeccably dressed, in custom-tailored suits from Savile Row, and accompanied by some of the city's most beautiful and accomplished women. The society pages of the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, and Vogue regularly featured images of Harrison dancing with debutantes, chatting with senators, or examining paintings at museum exhibitions. His smile was genuine but enigmatic, suggesting depths that the camera could never quite capture. But Harrison Blackwood was far more than just a pretty face with a trust fund, as some cynical observers occasionally suggested in private conversations. He had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Business School, where he had distinguished himself not only academically, but also as a thoughtful leader who could bridge different perspectives and find common ground among competing interests. His professors remembered him as a student who asked penetrating questions and offered innovative solutions to complex business problems that had stumped previous classes. During the E2E, decade following his graduation, Harrison had spent considerable time modernizing his family's banking operations, introducing new technologies and financial instruments that positioned Blackwood and Associates at the forefront of the rapidly changing world of international finance. Under his leadership, the bank had expanded into new markets across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, establishing correspondent relationships with financial institutions in major commercial centers from London and Frankfurt to Tokyo and Hong Kong. Harrison was known throughout the financial community for his sharp intellect, his uncanny ability to read market trends and anticipate economic shifts before they became apparent to other analysts, and his remarkable talent for cultivating relationships with powerful clients from around the globe. He spoke 4 languages fluently and had traveled extensively throughout Europe, Asia, and South America, building personal relationships with business leaders, government officials, and financial experts who could provide insights into emerging market opportunities. Those who knew Harrison best described him as charming but enigmatic, possessing a complexity that set him apart from many of his peers in Manhattan's financial elite. He could be the life of a party one moment, entertaining guests with witty anecdotes about his travels or insightful observations about art and literature, and then withdraw into thoughtful solitude the next, retreating to his study to read or simply to think through complex problems that occupied his analytical mind. This mercurial quality made him all the more attractive to the sophisticated women who moved in his social circles, each hoping to be the one who could unlock his deeper mysteries. Harrison collected rare books with the passion and knowledge of a serious scholar, focusing particularly on first editions of works on economics, philosophy, and exploration. His personal library, housed in his penthouse apartment, contained volumes dating back to the 16th century, including original treatises by Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and other foundational thinkers whose ideas had shaped modern economic theory. He enjoyed sailing his 42-foot yacht along the Connecticut coast during summer weekends, often taking small groups of friends or business associates on day trips that combined relaxation with substantive conversations about business, politics, and culture. Perhaps most intriguingly, Harrison was known to disappear for weeks at a time on what he called his thinking expeditions to remote locations around the world. These solitary journeys took him to places like the Scottish Highlands, the Swiss Alps, remote islands in the Caribbean, and isolated villages in South America, where he could disconnect from the pressures of business and social obligations. His friends and associates had grown accustomed to his occasionally unpredictable behavior, which they attributed to the pressures of managing vast wealth and responsibility at such a young age. Harrison lived in a magnificent penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, occupying the top 2 floors of a pre-war building that overlooked Central Park from its commanding position on Fifth Avenue. The space, which had been in his family for 3 generations, reflected both his refined taste and his family's long history in New York society. The apartment's rooms flowed gracefully from one to another, with high ceilings, original moldings, and tall windows that provided breathtaking views of the park's changing seasons. Priceless paintings by masters like Monet, Renoir, Picasso, and Cézanne hung on the walls, while first-edition books filled custom-built mahogany shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling in his private study. Oriental rugs from Persia and Turkey covered the hardwood floors, and antique furniture pieces from various periods created intimate conversation areas throughout the spacious rooms. The apartment's windows offered breathtaking views of Central Park, and Harrison often held intimate dinner parties there for influential figures from the worlds of finance, politics, and culture. Despite his wealth and exalted social position, those closest to Harrison detected a growing restlessness in him during the months leading up to his disappearance. His longtime secretary, Margaret O'Sullivan, a sharp-eyed Irish-American woman who had worked for the Blackwood family for over 15 years, later told investigators that Harrison had seemed increasingly distracted and concerned about something he refused to discuss, even with her. Margaret had developed an almost maternal protective instinct toward Harrison, and she prided herself on her ability to anticipate his needs and manage his complex schedule of business meetings, social obligations, and personal appointments. In the weeks before his disappearance, Margaret noticed that Harrison had made several mysterious phone calls from his office, speaking in hushed tones and closing his door when she approached with documents or messages. This behavior was highly unusual for Harrison, who typically conducted his business with complete transparency and often asked Margaret to take notes during important conversations. On multiple occasions, she had found him staring out his office window at the bustling streets of Lower Manhattan, lost in thought and seemingly unaware of her presence, even when she knocked on his door or spoke his name. Harrison's romantic life had also become a subject of considerable speculation in the weeks before he vanished. He had been dating socialite Victoria Pemberton, a stunning brunette from an equally prominent Boston family, for nearly 2 years. Victoria was intelligent, accomplished, and beautiful, with degrees from Wellesley College and Columbia University's School of Journalism. She worked as a freelance writer for several high-profile magazines, covering arts and culture events for publications like Harper's Bazaar and Town and Country. Their relationship had been the subject of constant coverage in the society pages of newspapers and magazines throughout the Northeast, with many observers expecting an engagement announcement at any moment during the upcoming holiday season. Victoria and Harrison appeared to be perfectly matched in terms of background, education, interests, and social standing. However, friends of both noticed that the couple had seemed strained during recent public appearances, with Harrison appearing distant and preoccupied even during intimate conversations with Victoria at social events. Victoria later told police investigators that Harrison had become increasingly distant and secretive during their final weeks together, often canceling planned dinners or weekend trips at the last minute with vague explanations about urgent business matters that required his immediate attention. When she pressed him for details about what was troubling him, Harrison would brush off her concerns and change the subject, sometimes becoming uncharacteristically irritable when she persisted in her questioning. The Rolls-Royce silver shadow that now lay buried in the Catskill forest had been Harrison's pride and joy, a mechanical masterpiece that perfectly embodied his sophisticated taste and appreciation for craftsmanship. He had purchased the vehicle new in early 1974, one of only a few hundred imported to the United States that year due to strict emission control regulations and currency exchange rates that made British luxury cars extremely expensive for American buyers. The car represented the absolute pinnacle of British automotive luxury and engineering excellence, with its handcrafted interior of Connolly leather in rich tan hues and burled walnut wood trim that had been carefully selected and matched by master craftsmen in the Rolls-Royce factory in Crewe, England. Every surface of the interior had been finished to perfection, with chrome-plated controls, lamb's wool carpeting, and seats that could be adjusted to provide optimal comfort during long-distance driving. Harrison had special ordered his silver shadow in British racing green, a color that perfectly complemented his sophisticated taste and old-money sensibilities, while also reflecting his appreciation for automotive history and tradition. The paint had been applied in multiple coats and hand-polished to a mirror finish that seemed to glow with an inner light. The car's distinctive grille, with its vertical chrome slats and the iconic Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament, announced its prestigious heritage to anyone who understood automotive excellence. The vehicle had become as much a part of Harrison's identity as his custom-tailored suits from Anderson & Shepard and his Harvard-class ring, which bore the inscription of his graduation year and degree. He was frequently seen driving through Manhattan's congested streets, the Rolls-Royce's elegant lines and distinctive presence turning heads wherever he went. The vehicle's presence at important business meetings and social events had become something of a trademark, a symbol of the Blackwood family's enduring prosperity and influence in American society. Harrison took meticulous care of the Rolls-Royce, having it serviced regularly by specialists who understood the complexities of British automotive engineering. The car was kept in a climate-controlled garage beneath his apartment building, where it was protected from the harsh elements of New York weather and the corrosive effects of road salt used during winter months. He personally supervised its washing and detailing, often spending Saturday mornings working alongside the garage attendant to ensure that every surface gleamed with pristine perfection. On the morning of October 15, 1975, Harrison Blackwood left his penthouse apartment as he did every weekday, dressed in a charcoal gray suit tailored specifically for him by his longtime Savile Row tailor, and carrying his leather briefcase, a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandfather. The briefcase contained the usual assortment of financial documents, correspondence, and legal papers that constituted the daily business of managing a major banking institution. But that morning, it also held documents that would later prove crucial to understanding the circumstances of his disappearance. The doorman, James Patterson, who had worked the building for over a decade and had known Harrison since he was a young man fresh out of business school, greeted him with the usual pleasantries as Harrison stepped into the crisp autumn air. Patterson later told investigators that he had noticed nothing unusual about Harrison's demeanor that morning, though he did recall thinking that Harrison seemed perhaps a bit more serious than usual, lacking his customary smile and brief conversational exchange about the weather or current events. The maple trees lining Fifth Avenue had begun their spectacular transformation into brilliant shades of red, gold, and orange, creating a picturesque backdrop for what appeared to be the start of another ordinary day in the life of one of Manhattan's financial elite. The morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of coffee and pastries from the small cafes that catered to the neighborhood's affluent residents. Traffic moved with its typical Manhattan rhythm, a symphony of car horns, diesel engines, and the occasional wail of sirens from emergency vehicles navigating the city's crowded arteries. Harrison's daily routine was as precise and methodical as the Swiss watches he collected, a habit that reflected both his disciplined nature and his appreciation for mechanical perfection. Each morning, he would walk the 6 blocks from his apartment to the Blackwood and Associates offices on Wall Street, taking the same route along Fifth Avenue and down through Central Park before heading east toward the financial district. This walk served as his transition time between his private life and his professional responsibilities, allowing him to mentally prepare for the day's challenges while enjoying brief moments of solitude amid the city's bustling energy. During his morning walk, Harrison would stop at the same newsstand operated by Giuseppe Martinelli, an elderly Italian immigrant who had come to America after World War II and had built a small but prosperous business selling newspapers, magazines, and tobacco products to the neighborhood's regular commuters. Giuseppe had served Harrison for years and knew to have his papers ready by 8:15 sharp, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and occasionally the London Times, when Harrison was following particular international business developments. Giuseppe prided himself on his ability to remember every regular customer's preferences and to engage in brief but meaningful conversations about current events, sports, or family matters. He had developed a genuine fondness for Harrison, whom he regarded as one of the few wealthy customers who treated him with genuine respect and courtesy rather than the condescending indifference that characterized many interactions with Manhattan's elite. That morning, Giuseppe later told investigators, Harrison seemed different somehow from his usual composed and confident self. While Harrison was always polite and cordial, there was usually an energy about him, a sense of purpose and direction that came from being born to lead and having spent his entire life preparing for positions of responsibility and influence. But on October 15th, Giuseppe noticed that Harrison's usual confident demeanor appeared strained and somewhat forced. His customary smile seemed to require effort rather than coming naturally, and he fumbled slightly while counting out the exact change for his newspapers, something the meticulous banker never did under normal circumstances. Giuseppe had observed thousands of customers over the years and had developed an intuitive ability to read people's moods and emotional states. Harrison's behavior that morning triggered his concern, though he could not have imagined the tragic significance of what he was witnessing. Harrison's first appointment of the day was scheduled for 9 o'clock with a potential new client, a consortium of European investors interested in American real estate ventures and international currency trading opportunities. Margaret O'Sullivan had prepared extensive files for the meeting, including background reports on the principals involved, financial projections for potential investments, and legal documentation required for international banking relationships. Margaret noticed that Harrison seemed unusually nervous as he reviewed the materials in his office, repeatedly checking his watch and asking her several times about details he would normally have memorized without effort. She observed him checking his appointment calendar multiple times, despite the fact that punctuality was rarely a concern for him, since his reputation and social position ensured that clients always waited for him rather than the reverse. His hands seemed slightly unsteady as he turned the pages of the financial reports, and she noticed a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in his air-conditioned office. The meeting with the European investors lasted longer than expected, stretching well past its scheduled 10:30 conclusion and into the late morning hours. Margaret could hear animated voices through the closed door of Harrison's office, though the heavy oak construction and thick carpet prevented her from making out specific words or understanding the nature of the discussion. The tone of the conversation seemed to fluctuate between cordial business discourse and what sounded like increasingly tense disagreement. At one point, she thought she heard Harrison's voice rise in what sounded like frustration or concern, though such displays of emotion were extremely rare for the normally composed and diplomatic banker. Harrison prided himself on maintaining professional equanimity even during the most challenging negotiations, and his ability to remain calm under pressure was one of his most valued skills in the complex world of international finance. When the clients finally departed at 11:45, Margaret noticed that they seemed less satisfied than the typical visitors to Harrison's office. The lead investor, a distinguished Swiss gentleman named Klaus Weber, appeared particularly stern and somewhat agitated as he shook Harrison's hand at the door. Weber was accompanied by two associates, both impeccably dressed European businessmen who maintained expressions of professional courtesy that barely concealed what appeared to be significant displeasure with the outcome of their meeting. Harrison's usual charm and confidence seemed somewhat diminished as he escorted the group to the elevator, and Margaret made a mental note to ask him about the meeting when he returned to discuss the afternoon's schedule. She had worked with Harrison long enough to recognize when business discussions had not proceeded according to his expectations, and the body language of all parties involved suggested that substantial disagreements had emerged during their conversation. But Harrison did not return to his office that day as expected. Instead, he stopped at Margaret's desk with an expression she had never seen before, a combination of determination and barely concealed anxiety that immediately triggered her maternal protective instincts. He informed her that he needed to handle an urgent personal matter that could not be postponed, speaking in clipped, precise tones that suggested significant stress, despite his attempts to maintain his usual professional demeanor. Harrison instructed Margaret to cancel his remaining appointments for the day, including what she knew was an important 3 o'clock meeting with the Board of Trustees from the Metropolitan Museum of Art regarding a substantial donation the Blackwood family was considering. When she asked if she should reschedule the museum meeting, Harrison seemed momentarily confused, as if he had forgotten about the important appointment entirely. This lapse was completely uncharacteristic for someone whose mental discipline and attention to detail were legendary among his business associates. Margaret watched with growing concern as Harrison gathered several files from his desk, placing them carefully in his leather briefcase, along with what appeared to be personal documents he retrieved from his office safe. His movements were deliberate but slightly hurried, suggesting that whatever crisis had emerged required immediate attention. She offered to contact his driver or to help him make arrangements for transportation, but Harrison declined with a slight smile that failed to reach his eyes. Harrison left the Blackwood & Associates offices at approximately 12:15 that afternoon, walking briskly through the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan toward the parking garage where he kept the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. Several witnesses, including the garage attendant and a hot dog vendor on the street corner, later confirmed seeing him retrieve his distinctive green luxury sedan and drive north through the financial district's congested streets toward the Brooklyn Bridge and the highways that led out of the city. The garage attendant, a young Puerto Rican man named Carlos Rivera, remembered the interaction clearly because Harrison seemed unusually impatient as he waited for his car to be brought up from the underground parking level. Typically, Harrison would engage in friendly conversation about family or neighborhood news while waiting, but that day he stood silently, checking his watch repeatedly and scanning the street as if he was concerned about being followed or observed. The last confirmed sighting of Harrison Blackwood came from a toll booth operator on the George Washington Bridge. At approximately 1:45 that afternoon, Harrison paid the toll to cross from Manhattan into New Jersey, heading northeast toward Interstate 87, which would take him into the Hudson Valley and toward the Catskill Mountain region, where his body would eventually be discovered 50 years later. The toll booth operator was a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy Chen, Detective Sarah Chen's grandmother, who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1950s and had worked the same booth for 15 years as a way to support her family, while her husband operated a small grocery store in Chinatown. Dorothy had developed an exceptional memory for faces and vehicles during her years of processing thousands of daily transactions, and she later provided investigators with one of the most detailed descriptions of Harrison's final movements. Dorothy remembered the transaction clearly for several reasons. First, the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow was an extremely rare and distinctive vehicle that stood out dramatically from the typical cars, trucks, and buses that crossed the bridge daily. Second, Harrison had seemed agitated and distracted when he handed over the toll money, fumbling with his wallet and dropping several bills before managing to pay the correct amount. Most memorably, she noticed that Harrison kept glancing in his rearview mirror, as if he was concerned about being followed by another vehicle. From that point forward, Harrison Blackwood and his Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth, like a ship disappearing beyond the horizon of human knowledge. No further sightings were reported, despite an extensive search effort that would eventually involve multiple law enforcement agencies throughout the Northeast and cost the Blackwood family hundreds of thousands of dollars in private investigator fees, reward money, and search-related expenses. When Harrison failed to return home that evening, his household staff initially assumed he had decided to spend the night at his country house in the Hamptons, something he occasionally did without advance notice when he needed solitude to think through complex business problems or to escape the social pressures of Manhattan life. Thus, household staff, including his longtime housekeeper Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison and his personal chef Henri Dubois, were accustomed to Harrison's occasionally unpredictable travel patterns and did not immediately raise concerns about his absence. However, when Harrison failed to appear at the office the following morning and did not respond to telephone calls from Margaret O'Sullivan, who had several urgent matters requiring his attention, she contacted Victoria Pemberton to inquire about his whereabouts. Victoria's concern deepened immediately when she realized that she had not heard from Harrison since their somewhat tense dinner conversation 3 nights earlier at Le Bernardin, one of their favorite restaurants in Manhattan. During that final meal together, Harrison had seemed preoccupied and distant, picking at his food and providing distracted responses to Victoria's attempts at conversation. When she had pressed him about what was troubling him, asking directly if there were problems with his business or if their relationship was causing him stress, Harrison had brushed off her concerns and changed the subject to neutral topics like the restaurant's wine list and their plans for the upcoming weekend. Now, faced with his mysterious absence, Victoria began to worry that their relationship problems might be more serious than she had realized, or that Harrison might be facing personal or professional crises he had been unwilling to share with her. The New York Police Department initially treated Harrison's disappearance as a routine missing person case, operating under the assumption that the wealthy banker had simply decided to take an impromptu vacation without informing anyone of his destination or duration of travel. Such behavior was not entirely unusual among the city's elite, who often had the resources and independence to travel spontaneously to exotic locations around the world for business or pleasure, sometimes remaining incommunicado for days or weeks at a time. Detective Robert Morrison, the veteran investigator assigned to the case, had spent 22 years with the NYPD and had handled dozens of similar situations involving prominent New Yorkers who had temporarily vanished only to resurface days or weeks later, with elaborate explanations about urgent business trips, romantic getaways, or personal retreats to exclusive resorts or private estates. Morrison's experience had taught him that wealthy individuals often lived by different rules and expectations than ordinary citizens, and their disappearances frequently involved complex personal or business arrangements that were initially misunderstood by concerned family members and associates. However, as hours turned to days and Harrison remained missing, the investigation began to take on a more serious tone and expanded scope. The Blackwood family's considerable influence and wealth ensured that the case received significant resources and attention from law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Harrison's father, Harrison Montgomery Blackwood, Jr., personally contacted the police commissioner and the mayor's office to demand a comprehensive search effort that would utilize every available resource and investigative technique. Private security firms were hired to supplement the official investigation, bringing specialized expertise in missing person cases and access to resources that were not available to government agencies. A substantial reward of $50,000 was offered for any information leading to Harrison's safe return, an amount that represented a fortune to most working-class New Yorkers in 1975 and generated hundreds of tips and reported sightings from across the country. The search for Harrison Blackwood and his missing Rolls-Royce quickly expanded beyond New York City's boundaries to encompass the entire Northeast Corridor and eventually much of North America. Law enforcement agencies throughout New England, England, the Mid-Atlantic states, and eastern Canada were provided with detailed descriptions of both the man and his distinctive vehicle, along with photographs and complete specifications that would enable immediate identification. Airports, train stations, and border crossings were monitored for any sign of the missing banker, while customs and immigration officials were alerted to watch for Harrison's passport or any attempt to leave the country under his identity. His credit cards and bank accounts were placed under careful surveillance to detect any suspicious activity or unusual transactions that might provide clues to his whereabouts or the circumstances of his disappearance. Detective Morrison and his expanding team began the methodical and time-consuming process of retracing Harrison's movements during the days and weeks leading up to his disappearance. They interviewed dozens of people who had interacted with him, from business associates and social acquaintances to service workers and casual contacts who might have observed unusual behavior or overheard conversations that could provide insights into his state of mind or potential destinations. A complex and troubling picture began to emerge of a man who, despite his outward success and confidence, had been grappling with some kind of significant personal or professional pressure that he had been unwilling or unable to share with even his closest friends and associates. The investigation revealed patterns of behavior that suggested Harrison had been preparing for some kind of major change or crisis during the weeks before he vanished. The financial analysis conducted by investigators revealed that Harrison had made several large and highly unusual transactions in the weeks before he disappeared, moves that were entirely inconsistent with his typically conservative and methodical approach to wealth management. He had liquidated a substantial portion of his investment portfolio, converting stock, holdings and bonds worth over $2 million into cash, and transferring the funds to offshore accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. When questioned about these transactions, Harrison's business partners and accountants expressed confusion and concern, noting that such moves made no sense from a financial planning perspective and represented a dramatic departure from the investment strategies that had guided the Blackwood family's wealth management for generations. The timing of these transfers, occurring during a period of market uncertainty and economic volatility, suggested either panic or preparation for circumstances that Harrison had not shared with his financial advisors. Perhaps even more troubling was the discovery that Harrison had been receiving mysterious telephone calls at both his office and his apartment during the month leading up to his disappearance. Margaret O'Sullivan told investigators that several calls had come from individuals who refused to identify themselves and insisted on speaking only to Harrison personally, becoming agitated or abusive when she attempted to screen the calls or take messages. On at least 2 occasions, Margaret had observed Harrison's demeanor change dramatically after taking such calls, leaving him visibly shaken and distracted for hours afterward. She described seeing him pace around his office, periodically stopping to stare out the window, as if lost in thought or concern about matters he refused to discuss. These behavioral changes were so uncharacteristic that Margaret had considered asking Harrison directly about the calls, but his obvious distress and her respect for his privacy had prevented her from pursuing the matter. The European investors who had met with Harrison on the morning of his disappearance became subjects of particular interest for the investigating team. Detective Morrison arranged to travel to Switzerland to interview Klaus Weber and his associates, hoping to uncover details about their business relationship with Harrison that might explain his subsequent disappearance and the apparent distress he had displayed following their meeting. However, Weber and his colleagues maintained strict confidentiality about their discussions with the American banker, citing client privacy concerns and Swiss banking regulations that protected such information from disclosure to foreign law enforcement agencies. The Swiss authorities, while courteous and professional, were unwilling to compel their citizens to provide information that was protected under their nation's famously strict financial privacy laws. What Morrison was able to determine through careful questioning and investigation was that the European group had been seeking to invest substantial sums in American real estate and financial markets, using Blackwood and Associates as their primary intermediary and advisor for navigating the complex regulatory environment that governed foreign investment in the United States assets. The amounts involved were enormous, potentially representing hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions that would have generated significant fees and commissions for Harrison's firm. However, something about the proposed arrangements had apparently concerned Harrison greatly, though Weber refused to elaborate on the specific nature of their disagreements or the reasons for Harrison's reluctance to proceed with the business relationship. The Swiss banker's carefully diplomatic responses and his associates' studied silence suggested that the meeting had involved more than routine investment discussions, but Morrison was unable to penetrate the wall of professional discretion that protected the details of their conversation. As weeks passed without any trace of Harrison or his vehicle, investigators began to consider more sinister possibilities that went far beyond a voluntary disappearance or business trip gone wrong. The world of international finance in the 1970s was a complex and sometimes dangerous environment where enormous sums of money changed hands through networks of banks, corporations, and government entities that were not always subject to rigorous oversight or regulation by law enforcement agencies. Harrison's access to these financial channels, combined with his family's prestigious reputation and his personal relationships with influential figures throughout the banking industry, would have made him a valuable asset to various legitimate and illegitimate organizations seeking to move money across international boundaries without attracting unwanted attention from regulatory authorities or law enforcement agencies. The investigation expanded to include federal agencies with expertise in financial crimes and international affairs. FBI agents specializing in white-collar crime began examining Harrison's business dealings for any connections to organized crime, money laundering operations, or other illegal activities that might have resulted in threats to his safety or attempts to coerce his cooperation in criminal schemes. The timing of Harrison's disappearance, occurring during a period of significant economic uncertainty and political upheaval both domestically and internationally, raised questions about whether he might have become involved in schemes that had ultimately put his life in danger. The mid-1970s were characterized by inflation, currency instability, political scandals, and social unrest that created opportunities for criminal organizations to exploit weaknesses in financial systems and regulatory structures. Victoria Pemberton emerged as both a crucial witness and a potential suspect in the investigation, though her obvious distress and cooperation with authorities gradually eliminated serious suspicion about her involvement in Harrison's disappearance. Her intimate relationship with Harrison had provided her with detailed knowledge of his habits, concerns, and recent behavioral changes that proved invaluable to investigators trying to understand his state of mind and possible motivations. During extensive interviews with Detective Morrison and his team, Victoria revealed disturbing details about Harrison's growing paranoia and secretiveness in the weeks before he vanished. She described how he had begun checking his apartment for listening devices, using a small electronic detector that he had purchased from a security equipment supplier, without explaining to her why such precautions had become necessary. Harrison had also begun varying his daily routines in ways that suggested he was concerned about being followed or watched by unknown individuals. Instead of taking his usual route to work each morning, he would randomly select different streets and sometimes even take taxis or public transportation instead of walking. He had started making restaurant reservations under false names and would insist on sitting at tables where he could observe the entrance and exits. Most significantly, Victoria disclosed that Harrison had given her a safety deposit box key just 3 days before his disappearance, along with cryptic instructions to use it only if something happened to him. The key was accompanied by a handwritten note containing the box number and the address of a bank branch in Midtown Manhattan, where Harrison maintained the box under an assumed name. When investigators obtained a warrant to open the safety deposit box, they discovered documents that deepened the mystery surrounding Harrison's final days, while providing the first concrete evidence that his disappearance might not have been voluntary. The box contained copies of financial records, correspondence with foreign banks, and what appeared to be evidence of money laundering schemes involving several of Blackwood and Associates' largest and most important clients. Most disturbing was a handwritten letter addressed to Victoria, sealed in an envelope, marked with explicit instructions to open only in the event of Harrison's death or prolonged disappearance. The letter, written in Harrison's distinctive handwriting and signed with his full name, provided a window into the fears and pressures that had been consuming him during his final weeks. In the letter, Harrison expressed his deep love for Victoria, while acknowledging that he had become involved in financial arrangements that had put both his reputation and his life at serious risk. He wrote that certain clients had been pressuring him to facilitate transactions that he believed were illegal, involving the movement of money from criminal enterprises through legitimate banking channels to obscure its origins and make it available for investment in legal businesses. Harrison explained that his attempts to extricate himself from these relationships and to refuse further cooperation with the money laundering schemes had resulted in increasingly serious threats against his safety and the safety of people he cared about. The letter revealed that he had been living in fear for weeks, unsure of whom he could trust, and uncertain about what steps he could take to protect himself without endangering others. The letter provided investigators with their first concrete evidence that Harrison's disappearance was likely involuntary and possibly connected to his murder. Harrison wrote that he feared for his life and had been making contingency plans in case he needed to disappear, quickly to protect himself and others from the criminal organizations that were pressuring him. He mentioned having prepared emergency funds and a safe refuge where he could hide if necessary, though he provided no specific details about the location or nature of this refuge for security reasons. The letter concluded with Harrison's fervent hope that he would be able to resolve his problems and return safely to Victoria and his normal life, but also included his acknowledgement of the very real possibility that they might never see each other again. He asked Victoria to remember him as he had been during their happiest times together, and to understand that any decisions he had made were motivated by his desire to protect her and his family from the dangerous individuals who had infiltrated his business life. Armed with this new and disturbing information, the investigation took on increased urgency and dramatically expanded scope. Federal agents began examining the international financial networks that Harrison had mentioned in his letter, uncovering a complex web of relationships involving banks, corporations, and government entities from multiple countries that had been used to launder vast amounts of money from illegal sources. The amounts of money involved were staggering, potentially representing billions of dollars in transactions that had been routed through American financial institutions to obscure their origins and destinations. The schemes involved sophisticated methods for converting cash from drug trafficking, arms dealing, and other criminal enterprises into legitimate investments in real estate, stocks, bonds, and other financial instruments that could be openly traded in legal markets. The investigation revealed that Harrison had initially become involved in these arrangements through what appeared to be legitimate business relationships with wealthy international clients, seeking to invest in American markets. However, over time, he had apparently discovered that many of these clients were actually fronts for criminal organizations, and that his bank was being used as a crucial link in money laundering operations that violated numerous federal laws. Harrison's attempts to withdraw from these relationships and to report his suspicions to federal authorities had apparently triggered a crisis that ultimately led to his disappearance and presumed murder. The criminal organizations involved had too much at stake to allow a prominent banker with detailed knowledge of their operations to cooperate with law enforcement agencies or to expose their schemes to public scrutiny. The search for Harrison's Rolls-Royce became a central focus of the expanded investigation, with law enforcement agencies across the Northeast conducting systematic searches of remote areas where the distinctive vehicle might have been hidden or disposed of by his killers. Helicopters equipped with advanced search equipment flew careful grid patterns over the Catskill Mountains, the Adirondacks, and other wilderness areas within a reasonable driving distance of Manhattan. Teams of divers searched lakes, rivers, and reservoirs throughout the region for any sign of the missing car and its occupant, while ground search teams combed through forests, abandoned properties, and other locations where evidence might have been concealed. The searches were hampered by the vast areas that needed to be covered, and the likelihood that professional criminals would have chosen burial or disposal sites that were extremely difficult to locate. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Harrison or his vehicle was found during the initial months of the intensive investigation. The case gradually evolved from an active search and rescue operation to a cold case missing person investigation, though the Blackwood family's considerable financial resources ensured that private investigators continued working on the matter long after. Official law enforcement agencies had been forced to reduce their involvement due to other pressing cases and budget constraints. Years passed, and the mystery of Harrison Blackwood's disappearance became one of New York City's most enduring and widely discussed unsolved cases. Periodic sightings of both Harrison and his distinctive Rolls-Royce were reported from locations around the world, from exclusive Swiss ski resorts to remote Caribbean islands to isolated villages in South America, where wealthy Americans were sometimes rumored to be living under assumed identities. However, none of these sightings were ever confirmed through credible evidence or reliable witness testimony, and many appeared to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking by individuals who had become fascinated by the case through extensive media coverage. The story had captured public imagination, partly because of its dramatic elements. The wealthy banker, the luxury car, and the mysterious disappearance that seemed to belong more to fiction than to real life. The Blackwood family never stopped searching for answers about Harrison's fate, refusing to accept that he was dead without conclusive proof, and maintaining hope that he might someday be found alive, perhaps suffering from amnesia or being held against his will in some remote location. Harrison's father hired a succession of private investigators over the decades, each bringing different theories and approaches to the case while consuming substantial amounts of the family's resources without producing definitive results. Some investigators focused on the international financial connections, believing that Harrison had been eliminated by criminal organizations seeking to protect their money laundering operations from exposure. These theories led to investigations in multiple countries and extensive surveillance of individuals suspected of involvement in international financial crimes. But no concrete evidence was ever discovered that could lead to arrests or prosecutions. Other investigators theorized that Harrison had voluntarily disappeared to escape prosecution for his involvement in illegal financial schemes, and was living under an assumed identity in a country without extradition treaties with the United States. This theory was supported by Harrison's large cash withdrawals and offshore account transfers prior to his disappearance, as well as his apparent preparation for a potential emergency departure. Harrison's mother, Catherine Blackwood, held onto the hope that her son was still alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia caused by an accident or trauma, or being held against his will by unknown captors who had some reason to keep him alive, but hidden. She maintained his penthouse apartment exactly as he had left it, paying the rent and utilities for decades while waiting for his return and refusing to allow anyone to disturb his personal belongings or to change anything about the space he had called home. The Rolls-Royce's absence from the building's parking garage served as a daily reminder of her son's mysterious fate, but Catherine refused to give up hope that both Harrison and his beloved car would someday reappear to restore her family to wholeness. She funded numerous searches and investigations over the years, always hoping that the next effort would be the one that finally brought her son home. The financial world that Harrison had inhabited continued to evolve dramatically during the decades following his disappearance, with changes that might have prevented the circumstances that had apparently led to his death. The international banking regulations that had been relatively loose and poorly coordinated in the 1970s were gradually tightened in response to growing concerns about money laundering, terrorist financing, and other criminal uses of the global financial system. Many of the offshore financial havens that had facilitated questionable transactions during Harrison's era were eventually forced to implement stricter reporting requirements and transparency measures that made it much more difficult for criminal organizations to move money through legitimate banking channels without detection. The Bank Secrecy Act and other federal legislation created new requirements for financial institutions to monitor and report suspicious transactions, while international cooperation in financial crimes investigations was greatly enhanced through new treaties and information-sharing agreements. Detective Morrison retired from the New York Police Department in 1992 after 35 years of service, but he never stopped thinking about the Blackwood case, which had become something of an obsession for him during his final years on the force. In his retirement, he occasionally reviewed the files and followed up on new leads that emerged over the years, maintaining contact with federal investigators and private detectives who continued to work on various aspects of the case. Morrison remained convinced that Harrison had been murdered by individuals connected to the international financial schemes described in the letter to Victoria Pemberton, and that the banker's body and vehicle were hidden somewhere in the wilderness areas of upstate New York, or possibly in a location much farther from Manhattan than the original search efforts had considered. He often drove through the Catskill Mountains during his retirement years, stopping to examine remote areas and abandoned properties where evidence might have been concealed decades earlier. Morrison's theory proved remarkably prescient when Tommy Rodriguez's excavator broke through the forest floor on that crisp October morning in 2025, revealing the first glimpse of corroded metal that had been hidden beneath the earth for exactly 50 years. As Detective Sarah Chen and her crime scene team began the careful and painstaking process of fully exposing the buried Rolls-Royce, the magnitude of the discovery became clear to everyone involved in the investigation. This was not simply an abandoned vehicle or the result of an accident that had somehow been forgotten over the decades. This was potentially the key to solving one of the most famous missing person cases in New York history, a case that had consumed enormous resources and captured public attention for 5 decades without resolution. The excavation process required extraordinary care and precision, with each shovelful of dirt potentially containing crucial evidence that had been preserved by the unique environment created by the vehicle's burial. The crime scene team worked methodically under Detective Chen's supervision, photographing and documenting every stage of the excavation while searching for any trace of human remains or other clues that might explain what had happened to Harrison Blackwood 50 years earlier. The soil around the car showed clear evidence of deliberate excavation and burial rather than natural accumulation over time. The uniform depth of approximately 6 feet, the careful positioning of the vehicle, and the systematic backfilling of the excavation site all indicated that professional equipment and experienced operators had been involved in concealing the evidence. The location's isolation, more than 2 miles from the nearest road, and accessible only by hiking trails, demonstrated careful planning by whoever had chosen this remote burial site. As more of the Rolls-Royce emerged from its earthen tomb, details became visible that confirmed its identity as Harrison's missing vehicle beyond any reasonable doubt. The distinctive British racing green paint, though heavily damaged by decades of burial, was still recognizable in areas where protective primers and sealers had prevented complete deterioration. The wire-spoke wheels, though corroded and partially collapsed under the weight of soil and time, retained their characteristic pattern and spoke configuration. Most conclusively, the vehicle identification number, once fully exposed and carefully cleaned by forensic specialists, matched exactly the records from Harrison's insurance company, registration documents, and the detailed descriptions that had been circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout the country during the original investigation. There was no doubt that this was indeed Harrison Blackwood's Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, finally discovered after half a century of concealment. The car's position and condition provided additional insights into the circumstances of its burial. The vehicle appeared to have been driven or transported to the site, and then carefully positioned in the excavated hole, before being covered with soil and forest debris. The relatively good preservation of the passenger compartment, protected by the vehicle's solid construction and sealed windows, had created an environment where organic materials and documents might have survived the decades of burial. The driver's door showed signs of damage that appeared to be bullet holes, suggesting that violence had indeed occurred at or near the vehicle. The pattern and location of the damage were consistent with gunshots fired from outside the car toward the driver's position, supporting theories that Harrison had been murdered rather than simply disappearing voluntarily or dying in an accident. Inside the vehicle, investigators found evidence that would dramatically alter their understanding of Harrison Blackwood's disappearance and provide answers to questions that had haunted his family and investigators for 50 years. The leather seats, though badly deteriorated by moisture and time, still retained traces of their original tan color and basic structural integrity. More importantly, the car's interior contained human remains that were immediately recognizable as belonging to an adult male of Harrison's approximate age and physical characteristics. The skeletal remains were carefully extracted from the vehicle and transported to the State Forensics Laboratory for detailed analysis and identification, while the vehicle itself was removed to a secure facility where every surface could be examined for additional evidence. The forensic examination of the remains found in the Rolls-Royce confirmed what many investigators had long suspected but could never prove. Harrison Montgomery Blackwood III had been murdered. The skeletal remains showed clear evidence of trauma consistent with multiple gunshot wounds, indicating that the prominent banker had been killed before his body and vehicle were transported to this remote burial site in the Catskill Mountains. The preservation of evidence within the sealed environment of the buried car provided forensic specialists with far more clues than they had dared hope for after so many decades. Traces of fabric from Harrison's clothing, fragments of leather from his shoes and briefcase, and even small metal objects like his watch and cufflinks were recovered from the vehicle's interior. Most significantly, advanced DNA analysis techniques that had not existed during the original investigation confirmed beyond any doubt that the remains were indeed those of Harrison Montgomery Blackwood III. Genetic material extracted from bone and teeth was compared with DNA samples from Harrison's living relatives, providing scientific certainty that the 50-year mystery had finally been solved. The forensic evidence suggested that Harrison had been shot multiple times at close range in what appeared to be an execution-style murder, rather than a robbery, accident, or random crime. The condition and position of the remains indicated that Harrison had been killed elsewhere and his body transported to the burial site along with his vehicle, probably within a day or two of his disappearance to minimize the risk of discovery. Additional evidence found within the car included personal effects that had been preserved by the burial environment and the vehicle's protective structure. Harrison's wallet, though damaged by moisture and chemical changes in the soil, still contained his driver's license, credit cards, and family photographs that could be identified through careful laboratory analysis. More significantly, investigators discovered Harrison's briefcase wedged beneath the driver's seat, apparently placed there either by Harrison himself or by his killers during the burial process. The briefcase, constructed of high-quality leather and equipped with brass fittings that had resisted corrosion, contained documents that provided new insights into the complex money laundering schemes that had apparently cost Harrison his life. These documents included correspondence with foreign banks, detailed records of suspicious financial transactions, and notes in Harrison's own handwriting, documenting his growing awareness of the illegal nature of the business arrangements he had been asked to facilitate. The papers provided a clear timeline of Harrison's discovery of the money laundering operation and his unsuccessful attempts to extricate himself from the criminal conspiracy. Perhaps most importantly, the briefcase contained a detailed memorandum that Harrison had apparently prepared for federal law enforcement agencies, describing the money laundering schemes and identifying key individuals involved in the criminal conspiracy. The document was clearly intended to serve as Harrison's protection against retaliation by providing authorities with enough information to prosecute the criminals if anything happened to him. The discovery of Harrison's remains and his buried Rolls-Royce sent shockwaves through New York's financial and social communities, where many individuals who had known Harrison or who had followed his case over the decades were still alive and able to witness the resolution of one of the city's greatest mysteries. The news dominated local and national media coverage for weeks, with extensive retrospective articles examining the original investigation and the social and economic context of the 1970s. Many people gathered to mourn Harrison's confirmed death, while celebrating the fact that his family would finally have answers to questions that had haunted them for 50 years. Victoria Pemberton, now 78 years old, and long since married to another man with whom she had raised 3 children, attended a memorial service organized by the Blackwood family to finally lay Harrison's memory to rest with proper dignity and ceremony. Victoria spoke at the memorial service about the young man she had loved and lost, describing Harrison as someone who had possessed both tremendous privilege and a genuine desire to use his position responsibly. She noted that his ultimate fate, dying because he had tried to do the right thing when faced with criminal pressure, was somehow consistent with the moral courage that had attracted her to him in the first place. The investigation into Harrison's murder took on new urgency with the discovery of his remains and the evidence found in his buried car, though the 50-year gap between the crime and its solution created significant challenges for prosecutors hoping to bring charges against those responsible. Detective Chen and her team, working in cooperation with federal investigators and prosecutors, began the complex process of reconstructing the events that had led to Harrison's death half a century earlier. The documents found in Harrison's briefcase provided crucial insights into the international financial conspiracy that had ultimately cost him his life, identifying banks, corporations, and individuals that had been involved in laundering money from criminal enterprises. However, The passage of time had eliminated most of the original participants, either through natural death or through their own involvement in criminal activities that had resulted in imprisonment or death. The evidence suggested that Harrison had been killed by individuals connected to a sophisticated money laundering operation that had used Blackwood and Associates and other prestigious financial institutions to move vast sums of money from criminal enterprises into legitimate financial markets. Harrison's attempts to withdraw from these arrangements, motivated by his growing awareness of their illegal nature and his moral objection to facilitating criminal activities, had apparently been viewed as an unacceptable threat by the criminal organizations involved. Federal investigators were able to identify several key figures in the money laundering conspiracy through the documents found in Harrison's briefcase and through comparison with financial records that had been preserved in various government archives. However, most of these individuals had died of natural causes during the decades since Harrison's murder, while others had been killed in gang wars or had disappeared into witness protection programs. The investigation did reveal connections to organized crime families, corrupt government officials, and international financial institutions that had operated with virtual impunity during the relatively unregulated financial environment of the 1970s. The scale and sophistication of the money laundering operation was far greater than investigators had originally suspected, involving billions of dollars and networks that extended throughout North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. The remote location where Harrison's body and car were buried provided additional clues about his killers and their methods of operation. The burial site was located on property that had once belonged to a construction company with documented ties to organized crime families in the New York metropolitan area. Heavy equipment from this company would have been readily available to dig the deep hole required to bury the Rolls-Royce, and the company's legitimate construction activities in the area would have provided perfect cover for the burial operation. Investigators also discovered that several employees of the construction company had reported suspicious nighttime activities in the forest area during late October 1975, shortly after Harrison's disappearance. These reports, which had been dismissed at the time as routine equipment maintenance or security patrols, took on new significance in light of the discovery of Harrison's burial site and the evidence it contained. The investigation revealed that Harrison's murder had been carefully planned and executed by professional criminals who had extensive experience in disposing of bodies and evidence without detection. The choice to bury Harrison with his distinctive Rolls-Royce suggested both practical and symbolic motivations that reflected the killer's sophistication and their desire to send a message to others who might consider betraying the organization's interests. From a practical standpoint, the burial eliminated two pieces of evidence that could have led investigators to the killers: Harrison's body, which might have contained forensic evidence linking him to his murderers, and his distinctive vehicle, which could have been traced through various means to reveal details about his final movements and the circumstances of his death. The symbolic aspect of burying Harrison with his luxury vehicle served as a message about the fate that awaited others who might consider betraying the criminal organization's interests. The Rolls-Royce represented Harrison's wealth, status, and social position, all of which had failed to protect him from the consequences of his moral decision to oppose criminal activities. Despite the wealth of new evidence discovered with Harrison's remains, the investigation faced significant challenges in pursuing criminal charges related to his murder. Most of the key figures identified through the financial documents and other evidence had died during the 50 years since the crime was committed, while the few surviving individuals who might have had knowledge of the murder were elderly and claimed to have no memory of events from so long ago. The statute of limitations had long since expired for most potential charges related to the money laundering conspiracy that had led to Harrison's murder. However, murder charges do not expire. Under New York law, and investigators continued to pursue any possible leads that might result in criminal prosecution for Harrison's killers, however unlikely success might be after such an extended period. The discovery also provided closure for federal investigators who had spent decades investigating the international financial crimes that Harrison had stumbled into during his final weeks. The case became a valuable study in the evolution of money laundering techniques and the importance of international cooperation in combating financial crimes that cross national boundaries. The Blackwood family finally had the answers they had sought for 50 years, though the truth was far more tragic than they had hoped during the many years when they maintained hope that Harrison might still be alive somewhere. Harrison had not voluntarily disappeared to start a new life in some exotic location. He had been brutally murdered for trying to do the right thing when faced with criminal pressure, to facilitate illegal financial transactions. His integrity and moral courage had ultimately cost him his life, but his family found some comfort in knowing that he had died trying to protect both his reputation and his institution's integrity rather than succumbing to criminal pressure or participating willingly in illegal activities. The documents found in his briefcase demonstrated that Harrison had been prepared to cooperate with law enforcement agencies to expose the money laundering operation, even knowing that such cooperation might put his life at risk. Harrison's nephew, Harrison Montgomery Blackwood IV, who had been named after his missing uncle and who was now a successful investment banker in his own right, spoke for the family at a press conference following the discovery. He noted that while the family was grateful to finally have answers, they were also proud to learn that Harrison had died as a man of principle, who had refused to compromise his moral values, even when faced with threats to his personal safety. The discovery of Harrison's Rolls-Royce buried in the Catskill forest became a sensation in both traditional and social media, generating international headlines and renewed interest in cold case investigations throughout the world. The story captured public imagination partly because of its dramatic elements. The wealthy banker, the luxury car burial, and the 50-year mystery that had finally been solved through a combination of chance discovery and modern forensic science. But the case also resonated with the public because it illustrated the dangers faced by individuals who attempt to stand up to powerful criminal organizations, and because it demonstrated that justice, however delayed, could eventually prevail over those who believed they could commit murder with impunity. The story became a symbol of hope for families of victims in other unsolved cases, showing that advances in forensic science and investigative techniques could breathe new life into even the oldest cold cases. Law enforcement agencies throughout the country used the case to highlight advances in forensic science and investigative techniques that had made it possible to extract meaningful evidence from a crime scene that had been hidden for 5 decades. The preservation of DNA evidence, financial documents, and other materials within the buried vehicle demonstrated how modern forensic methods could solve cases that had seemed hopeless, using the technology available at the time the crimes were committed. Educational institutions and law enforcement training programs began incorporating the Blackwood case into their curricula as a study in the evolution of financial crime investigation and the importance of persistence in cold case investigations. The case demonstrated how criminal conspiracies could remain hidden for decades, only to be exposed through advances in forensic science and investigative techniques that had not existed when the original crimes were committed. The case also illustrated the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining detailed records, as documents created 50 years earlier had proved crucial in understanding the circumstances of Harrison's murder and the complex criminal conspiracy that had led to his death. The meticulous documentation created by the original investigators had provided the foundation for the modern forensic analysis that had finally solved the case. Tommy Rodriguez, the Excavator operator who had made the initial discovery found himself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight as media outlets sought to interview the man whose routine work had solved one of New York's greatest mysteries. Rodriguez, a humble worker who had simply been doing his job when he uncovered the buried Rolls-Royce, was overwhelmed by the attention, but proud to have played a role in providing closure for the Blackwood family and answers to questions that had haunted investigators for 5 decades. Detective Sarah Chen reflected on the case as she prepared her final report on the investigation, noting the strange coincidence that her grandmother Dorothy had been the last person to see Harrison Blackwood alive, and that she herself had been the detective to finally discover what had happened to him. The connection between the 2 generations of her family and the Blackwood case seemed to represent the long arc of justice that had finally reached its conclusion after 50 years of mystery and speculation. Chen noted in her report that the discovery of Harrison's remains had provided answers to questions that had haunted investigators for 50 years, but had also raised new questions about other potential victims of the same criminal organization. The documents found in Harrison's briefcase suggested that the money laundering conspiracy had been far more extensive than previously known, potentially involving dozens of other financial institutions and hundreds of millions of additional dollars in illegal transactions. As autumn returned to the Catskill Mountains 1 year after the discovery, Detective Chen made a final visit to the burial site where Harrison Blackwood's Rolls-Royce had been found. The area had been restored to its natural state, with new trees planted to replace those that had been removed during the excavation. Only a small memorial plaque marked the location where one of New York's greatest mysteries had finally been solved. Standing in the peaceful forest setting, Chen considered how the discovery had brought closure not only to the Blackwood family, but to an entire generation of investigators who had worked on the case over the decades. The buried Rolls-Royce had served as a time capsule, preserving evidence and memories from a different era, while waiting patiently for the moment when modern forensic science could unlock its secrets and reveal the truth about Harrison Blackwood's fate.